And Chief Lofts will speak about Cassirer and Nishida, the self-awakening, which is expressive realization of the place of the symbolic. I was already warned that Steve is 1 minute longer, wants to speak 1 minute longer than the 15 minutes, but that's not a problem, I suppose. So without further ado, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers for organizing this conference in these remarkably difficult times. It's good to keep the life of the mind going, and organizers are essential to that process. Introduction. Elsewhere, I have examined the many similarities between Cassirer and Nishida. They were in every way contemporaries who shared a common intellectual lineage in Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, and Goethe. Their philosophical projects sought to, in different ways, to overcome the epistemological and ontological dualisms of the Western metaphysical tradition that they trace back to Aristotle's concept of substance. Each sought a way beyond the irreconcilable opposition between Leibniz philosophy and transcendental philosophy. Their central concepts, the symbolic and the place, or Basho, grew out of a philosophical engagement with mathematics. Finally, their conceptions of the symbolic and the place are rooted in the polemos of Heraclitus and not in the dialectical sublimation of Hegel. For Cassirer, the logic of the symbolic is a dialectic unity, a coexistence of contraries. For Nishida, the logic of place is a dialectical unity of contradictory self-identity. Today I would like to take a step further and suggest that Cassirer's philosophy of the symbolic and Nishida's philosophy of the place not only mirror each other, but must be thought together as giving expression to what I will call the place of the symbolic. The of in this expression, the place of the symbolic, must be taken as expressing a double genitive. That is to say, it articulates a bilateral dynamic movement from one element to the other that gives expression to the unity of the mutual determination of oppositions that are at once subjective and objective. As a subjective genitive, the symbolic becomes the subject and place its object. It is the place of the symbolic. That is to say, a place opened through the symbolic and a place that takes place within the symbolic. As an objective genitive, the place becomes the subject and the symbolic its object. It is the place of the symbolic, that is to say, the place where the symbolic is placed and takes place. In hearing the of as a double genitive, both subjective and objective, we can perhaps hear the correspondingness between the place and the symbolic. That is to say, the reverberation by which each expresses itself by reflecting, echoing, or mirroring the other. The place of the symbolic thus seeks to articulate the logic and structure of the relation of givenness in the encounter between the place and the symbolic, between the I and the thou, the subject and the object, the self and the world, sense and facticity. My paper today thinks together Nishida and Cassirer by way of the double genitive expression, the place of the symbolic. Part 1 begins by framing this double reading of Cassirer and Nishida in terms of the 1929 DeVos debate between Cassirer and Heidegger. Against this background, Part 2 clarifies the place of the symbolic by examining the dialectical logic of sense, Cassirer, and place, Nishida, in terms of the self-expression of the historical world that is the self-awakening of the place of the symbolic. The paper concludes by returning to the central issue of the DeVos debate and suggests how Nishida is able to move us beyond the impasse. Part 1. In 1929, Cassirer and Heidegger met in Davos, Switzerland, to debate the question, what is the human? What is the Mensch? The debate focused on the proper interpretation of the productive imagination in Kant. As Heidegger observes, while the terminus ad quem of Cassirer's philosophy of symbolic forms as a critique of culture was clear, its terminus ad quo was entirely problematic. The reverse was the case for Heidegger. The terminus ad quo of Heidegger's project was found in the facticity of Dasein, but its terminus ad quem remained unclear and undefined. Heidegger's observations mark out not only the irreconcilable opposition between them, but the irreconcilable opposition between form, predicate judgment, and existence, primary substance, that has plagued the Western metaphysical tradition from its beginning. Heidegger descends the Hegelian ladder into the existential ground of facticity on which the ladder rests. But as for the nature and being of the ladder on which he himself must stand, he can say nothing. Cassirer follows the ladder up to its highest manifestation in ideas and thought, and ultimately to a philosophy of culture. But on what the ladder stands, he can say nothing. A transcendental critique of culture is limited to determining the logic of sense that forms the factum of culture, whereas the existential phenomenology is limited to a hermeneutics of the facticity of Dasein. For this reason, Heidegger questions whether a transcendental philosophy can ever be a philosophy of culture in the sense of an account of the concrete historical world, whereas Cassirer argues, as does, I think, Nishida, that beginning from the radical finitude of Dasein, Heidegger has no access to the realm of transpersonal meaning, of the objective expression of a shared world. Heidegger's Dasein remains enclosed in the classical inner citadel of the self, albeit an existential citadel of Dasein's authentic understanding, and therefore has no access to the alterity of the other, the thou, nor requires one. Thus, for Cassirer as for Nishida, Heidegger's philosophy cannot account for the other, the thou, that lies beyond the understanding of Dasein. For Cassirer, there is no other way from one Dasein to another than through the world of form. For Nishida, too, Heidegger fails to account for the thou as the absolute other in the constitution of the self. For both Cassirer and Nishida, the I and the thou not only encounter one another in the world of expression, but it is this encounter that constitutes the historical world of expression that creates the historical world as the place of the symbolic. Finally, Heidegger's existential phenomenology, beginning from its starting point, also contains no possibility of ethics. The gulf between form and existence at the heart of the DeVos debate is, for Nishida would argue, a false dichotomy, an empty abstraction that is a logical consequence of an ontology of self-identity. Whereas Cassirer's philosophy can explain the transcendental logic of the symbolic forms that form and configure a world of sense, it cannot speak to the facticity of a historical world. Whereas Heidegger's philosophy can explain the facticity and finitude of Dasein, it cannot speak to the form of sense that provides Dasein with its visibility, if not its reality, to the historical world in which Dasein lives. There is no shortage of attempts to argue for the one against the other, and every attempt to reconcile them has failed. We stand here before an impasse between two antithetical normative images of the human. Part 2. The expression, the place of the symbolic, brings together the place of the historical world of Nishida with the sense-bestowing horizon of the symbolic forms of Cassirer that are world-forming through the double genitive. The historical world is, for Nishida, the event of facticity. It is the place that takes place, or better, that is always taking place. The symbolic is, for Cassirer, the world-forming sense-bestowing horizons by which life gains its visibility and reality. The self-awareness of life is possible only if life gives itself form. For it is precisely by this alterity of form that it gains its reality and its visibility. To detach the world of life absolutely from the world of form and oppose the two means nothing other than to separate its reality from its visibility. For both, life is at once flux without pause, and yet something enclosed in barriers and contents, formed about midpoints, individualized, and therefore always a bounded configuration that continually jumps its bounds. In short, life is an immanent transcendence in life. Thus, we no more encounter formless life than we do lifeless form. As Nishida concisely says, life is form, and life must be a self-identity of contradiction. And the concrete life that is truly creative exists as the self-determination of the world. There is no life that is not creative. For this reason, the world of true life must be expressive. For Cassirer and Nishida, symbols in the symbolic are world-forming, but also they have their own reality in the historical world as the expression of the historical world. And in fact, only as self-expressions of the historical world do they have the power to form the historical world. In this way, historical life is called forth by objective expression, such that life is always mediated by the objective expression of culture. For both Cassirer and Nishida, there is nothing called life that is not mediated by objective expression. Culture is, for Nishida and Cassirer, the self-determination of the expressive world as historical nature. It is only through this world of expression, as an objective world of sense, that we have a common shared world. The act of symbolic expression is the place of consciousness. Symbolic forms of expression, language, art, religion, and science, are the cultural modes by which the historical world and our thinking about that reality are formed and configured. There is nothing outside or prior to the act of symbolic expression. The act of symbolic expression is performative in that it creates that which it expresses. The content of expression, activity, and the expression itself are one. There is not expression because there is a self in world, rather there is a self in world because there is expression. The world of linguistics and artistic expressions occupy a privileged place in Cassirer and Nishida's theories of culture. Language and art are the basic ways of objectification, of raising consciousness to the level of seeing objects. What is called the world of artistic expression is not divorced from the world of historical actuality. On the contrary, the former is within the latter. Even what is called artistic expression, expressive activity, comes from the self-determination of the historical world that itself expressly determines itself. And we might say that the verbal expression is not the effect of thought, but its condition of possibility. Our thinking possesses its possibility on the basis of verbal expression, and on the basis of verbal expression, our thinking escapes its subjectivity and becomes objective. The ground of our thinking is the world of verbal expression. What I'm arguing is that Cassirer's transcendental critique of culture as a philosophy of culture, objective genitive, needs to be grounded in and by Nishida's philosophy of culture, subjective genitive. As a philosophy of culture, Cassirer's account of the symbolic provides an analysis of how the reflective rational forms of culture emerge from the more concrete modes. This involves, however, the self-reflexivity not of reason, as in the case of Hegel, but of the self-reflexivity of culture. Hegel identifies speculative reasons with the objectified concrete universals and distinguishes them from abstract universals. Abstract universals negate particularity and level down a group of individuals as being identical with each other in some respect. By contrast, the concrete universal manifests itself in and through the different particularizations of the universal, which are held within it as part of the universal sense. Like the concrete universals, the functional concept of mathematics allows no separation between the universal and the particulars of the ordered series. What Cassirer calls the symbolic function is the generalization of Hegel's concrete universal as the cultural forms of the cultural reality that form the concrete historical world of sense. The concept of culture, objective genesis, is, however, always a concept of culture, subjective genitive. That is to say, the concept of culture that conditions a cognitive theoretical sense of the life world of meaning itself is a concept that belongs to a historical cultural world of meaning. As a philosophy of culture, subjective genitive, Nishida's philosophy is a transcendental account of the facticity of culture that is an existential project of culture's self-awakening, its self-realization by way of its self-expression. However, this philosophy of culture of Nishida, subjective genitive, requires the philosophy of culture of Cassirer, objective genitive. The philosophy of the place of the symbolic, double genitive, is an attempt to articulate a philosophy of culture, double genitive. Nishida, too, adopts Hegel's concept of the concrete universal to articulate his concept of place, which then becomes the historical world as the facticity of the world that develops dynamically through its self-expression. In the expression of the place of the symbolic, the two concrete universals form a contradictory self-identity of the facticity of the historical world and a transcendental sense of the world, to speak with Nishida, such that the one is in the other and the other is in the one, to speak with Cassirer. The sense of facticity is the facticity of sense. The place of the symbolic that gives rise to Japanese culture, according to Nishida, is the place of nothing, the sense of the formless. And Japanese culture expresses itself by expressing the form of the formless in its language and in art forms. The form of the formless is the symbolic expression of the place of nothing. Conclusion. For Cassirer and Nishida, there is a co-constitutional relation between the individual and the historical world as the expression of the place of the symbolic. One's self-awareness, that is to say, one's self-realization, takes place in and through the one's self-expression. One's self-expression, however, mirrors, that is to say, expresses, realizes the self-awareness of the reality of the Tao, that is to say, the self-realization of the historical world as it expresses itself. Here, too, we encounter the correspondence of the double genitive, the I of the historical world, as the I of the other. The I-other relation stands at the heart of the symbolic expressive act by which the self, the other, and the world are given form. However, as you are all well aware, ultimately, the historical world and with it the individual self express the Basho of nothing. The nothing expresses itself in the multiplicity of the self-expressions, realizations of individuals in the historical world. Everything as such is a thou escaping one's grasp in its self-expression. If we return to the DeVos debate, we would see that such a view would allow us to advance beyond the impasse. But alas, our time is up today. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would like to learn more about the concept of history in your combination of Nishida and Cassirer. I understood very well that both are some kind of complementary to each other. And I would like to know what follows from that for our understanding of the notion of history. Is there any sense in history? Possibly. I'm asking, since your reading of Hegel or your treatment of Hegel seems to foreclose a reading of history that might have any sense, because as I understood you, history is just a flow from one moment to another moment without any normative structure or without any direction in it. So maybe you could elaborate on this a bit.
Okay, so we should quickly have some food brought in, because it's the answer to that question is long. The short answer is this. There is no end to history at all. Once Cassirer removes the concept of a substantial foundation, and so therefore critiques Hegel, you cannot have an end of history where the subject becomes subject, right? Substance, subject, living substance, as Hegel calls it. That would be the end of history, where the subject and subject and substance are one. Unfortunately for Cassirer, he's moving very quickly out of this, and he's still working in this tradition, so he doesn't know what to replace it with. He doesn't have a concept of the absolute nothing the way Nishida does. Nishida has tools at his disposal that will allow him to do this. So what Cassirer speaks of is that the symbolic transcends into what he calls sheer possibility. Now, within the framework of the Western ontological tradition, God or subject is always understood as pure act. And the concept of pure possibility, although sometimes some Aristotelian scholars say that Aristotle is committed to a concept of pure possibility, is actually an oxymoron. And you find this idea of pure possibility sprinkled through the tradition, but in sort of thinkers like Master Eckhart. So the Godhead is the pure possibility of God. And so what I think Cassirer is mining there is this concept of pure possibility, which would be I would argue, the Western version of the Basho of absolute nothing. Therefore, yes, there is no end to history, because history is a movement, a creative movement from moment to moment for Cassirer. You're constantly involved in what he calls a renaissance, which is a constant imminent transcendence of life itself, constantly giving itself new form, moving, as Nishida would say, from the form to the form, creative moment to creative moment. So we are, in that we are creative, constantly transforming the world as it transforms us. Sorry, that's my short answer. I attempted an answer to the question.
This was quite illuminating. Thank you very much. The only problem I have is, how do we narrate this kind of history? Is there any possibility to make a story out of these moments, following from one to another? That was the meaning of my question, actually. How can we narrate this? Is there any structure to this flow of moment to moment to moment? That is interesting.
Yeah. I think that I'm searching for a quick way to answer the question. I know what I want to say, but Dogen has a problem. Dogen's philosophy of Zen comes out of a fundamental problem for Dogen. The reconciling the idea of original awakening with acquired awakening. If you turn back to the Western tradition, let's say Heidegger, just to pull out one example, you have this concept of moving towards anticipatory resoluteness as the authentic understanding of Dasein's being towards end. And sometimes when you read Heideggerian literature, you get the sense that, well, we started out as absorbed into the Das Man, and somehow we have to have the call, and then we move towards this authentic thing. But really, Heidegger is very clear that authenticity is an existential modification of inauthenticity and vice versa, such that we are always already in a state of anticipatory resoluteness. Otherwise, we wouldn't be Dasein for Heidegger. And so there, too, you have this sort of double problem of already being something that we need to somehow return to. And I think that the symbolic works and the creative moment works only in that it is already a narrative of that creative process. And that's what the double genitive, I'm trying to manipulate the double genitive, or mine or exploit the double genitive to try to give that sense of the place of the symbolic as a place that is already symbolizing itself as it creates the place, and so it only does that way. Your question is touching on a point that is maybe the most difficult for me yet to still articulate.
Sorry for that, Steve.
No.